all this time and all his effort coming from California to Madrid, also waking up today at 7, taking the flight to Porto, driving to Bom Jesus first because the driver got lost. And then actually making it to the center of the city where actually the Professor Al-Marashi is staying. And thanking him from the bottom of my heart for being here with us and preparing yet another updated, edge-cutting lecture based upon his lifelong research. Thank you very much, Professor Al-Marashi.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And unfortunately, I think you're going to find my lifelong research a bit morose and morbid and macabre, but it is something I'm trying on you for the first time. So you are I'm experimenting with you. And it's basically looking at the events that began after October 7th. Primarily the foreign policy of Israel, a non-state actor, Hamas. But there's something missing in the analysis. And I'm not sure if you've been introduced to this concept. If not, I'm going to be introducing you to the idea of necropolitics. Okay. This class is, or this lecture is called, and I'm just playing with the letter H, the history of the Hashishiin, Hamas, human cyborgs, and homicide attacks. And really what I'm talking about is the history of suicide in international relations. The history of suicide and voluntary death, because I don't think you can understand how we got to the events of October 7th without understanding this subject. It's, like I said, it's morbid, it might be emotionally challenging, but nonetheless, it's for that reason we need to study it, because it's rarely examined in international relations. So, what is necropolitics? Well, if there is a society for the end of necropolitics, how do we define what they want to end? And the easiest definition I'm going to go for is the following. It's an idea developed by somebody from Cameroon. I'm going to pronounce his first name Akile, but the French would pronounce it differently. Mbembe. Okay. Necropolitics is his response to Michel Foucault's biopower. If biopower is about the modern state's attempt to control life and the health of its citizens, you are all biopolitical citizens at one point or the other during the COVID-19 pandemic. Necropolitics is, we could say, the response from the global south to Michel Foucault's biopower. If biopower is about what is biological and living, necropolitics is very simply the politics of death. Or, in his words, Mbembe was clear that necropolitics is more than a right to kill, but also the right to expose other people to death. The clearest example being in the response to the death of 1,200 Israeli citizens. Okay. A professor at San Diego State, Farid Abdul-Noor, basically asked in response, what is the value of a Palestinian life vis-a-vis an Israeli life? Okay. And more or less he argued it's become this almost macabre ratio of almost 1 to 5. Okay. Now that was in the beginning of the conflict. Okay, but it is this. Necropolitics is a theory of the walking dead, namely a way of analyzing how contemporary forms of subjugation of life to the power of death forces some bodies to remain in different states of being located between life and death. Mbembe uses the example of slavery, apartheid, the colonization of Palestine. Okay, so of course, what he was writing about in his academic career. I am now updating it. Necropolitics was often used to refer to the Palestinian population. What I find surprising is that since the events of October 7th, no one has made an attempt to update it, to basically tell us what it means for Palestinian life in Gaza. The figure of the suicide bomber to show how different forms of necropower over the body. Okay, so he was talking originally about the suicide bomber. So I'm just going to give you now a history of the suicide bomber, a global history of the suicide bomber. Statists racialize the state of exception, urgency, martyrdom, reduce people to precarious conditions of life. So this is what we're going to do on our journey together. Necropolitics is a theory of the walking dead. It is the right to expose other people to death more than a right to kill. So in other words, you've probably been introduced to the following events in history. I am going to argue all of them, or I'm going to create a narrative of all of them through a necropolitical lens. So the first is our first necropolitics in art. You've probably all have seen the painting of Guernica. This is a painting my student took at the Reina Sofia Museum. What makes this a necropolitical work of art is the following. It is a unique form of necropolitics. What Pablo Picasso was capturing was a novel form of death. If anything, death usually came from the horizon. And really, Mbembe was all about, necropolitics is about the space in which death occurs. Imagine through most of human history, if you were in an urban center, death came on the horizon. It was a marching army who was besieging your city walls. It might have been a ship in the harbor that would have been blasting your town. What Picasso was trying to capture was the following. The novelty. Look at the way the heads are contorted upwards. The novelty of death coming from above. The novelty of Nazi Germany. Its ability to coerce from the skies. This would represent managing death from above, from a safe distance. Keep in mind, what does aerial bombardment mean? For the pilot and the combatant nation, it is a safe distance where they are immune from harm. Take this all the way to the drone of today. Okay. What did it mean for the necropolitical masses below, though? It was an indiscriminate way of death. Okay. What is being captured here, I would argue, is a term I've invented, but it's a sentient security. What do I mean by sentient security? It's not only capturing the death of humans, and this is what human security tries to capture, the death of the vulnerable, the civilians, children, look at the dead baby, the mother wailing, but also the cows and horses. And for this, I would argue that this is kind of an example of not just human security, but sentient security, anything that has the ability to feel, being captured in an iconic work of art in 1937. Necropolitical death. I want you to imagine this from 1937. A plane that was originally meant to transport passengers is delivering weapons of mass destruction over a mass distance over the masses. And this is what Mbembe was all about, was looking at necropolitics was about the ability to inflict death on the masses. Now, go from 1937, from 1945 then, what am I arguing? That the bombing of Hiroshima was the evolution of this trend. It was basically the management of necropolitics in a split second. Who would have thought that could have happened in the split second? The ability of Oppenheimer to harness energy to eliminate an urban center literally in less than a second. All of this is, I argue, a history of necropolitics. Now, How do we bear witness to necropolitics? A mural was created at the United Nations, and I want you to think of the imagery at the lobby of the UN General Assembly. This piece of this kind of simulacrum of necropolitical art was more or less a reminder to the international community in a multilateral forum that Guernica would never happen again. But sure enough, Guernica did happen again. You see, this is forcing us to bear witness to it. And so I take this image from one of my students. Here she is bearing witness to the act of necropolitics, but doing it through her Instagram account. And this gets me to the other reality that we're looking at in this lecture, or I should better say a hyper reality. And of course, the notion of hyperreality is from the French theorist Jean Baudrillard. And what I would argue is what we're witnessing in Gaza is not a war in real time. It's a war that we experience in hyperreality. And what do I mean by this hyperreality? It's the following. It involves actors in international relations. How do we theorize the celebrity? Or in this case, Ross, the professor from Friends. Here, Ross, and of course, this is very recently the death of, if you want to talk about a great actor in international relations in terms of globalization, I can't think of anything better than the TV series Friends. Lisa Kudrow once said, it bodes well for world peace that Friends is known all around the world. Okay. In this case, the Friends actor, though, is doing what? What are we seeing here is the contestation of the commemoration of death, okay? In the recent aftermath of the attack, okay, David Schwimmer is saying, Saturday was the largest murder of Jews in a single day since the Holocaust. The rape, torture, kidnapping, and killing of so many Israeli civilians, including children, the elderly, and infants, is an atrocity. So in other words, read between his lines, he's saying this is a violation of human security. Any attempt to rationalize or justify, now he's already declaring this as a genocide. And so what do we have here? That's why I just simply call it the contestation of the commemoration of mass murder, is now the invocation of the term genocide on both sides. The term genocide has its own history, but I'm going to look at other sides, if you will, in this lecture, is indefensible and anti-Semitic. So from genocide, I am going to more or less say, instead of focusing on genocide in international relations, let's look at the word suicide. Now, the Israeli state, this is not just about actual violence, but the Israeli state made an effort around 2000 to basically argue that anytime Hamas conducted what's called a suicide attack, that it should be called a homicide attack, because rarely does the suicide bomber just die in the attack. Usually a good number of civilians are often killed, or even if it's Israeli soldiers, the Israeli state was trying to craft the narrative of these being homicide attacks. And then from suicide to homicide, let's not forget that there is also an ecocide involved in this conflict. Ecocide in the terms of this, the weaponization of water. Okay. In the initial stage of the conflict, when water was deprived to Gaza, okay, that's not the ecocide. The ecocide is this, is the salinization of the water in the aquifers under the Gaza Strip, I would argue is an ecocide, in that desalinization facilities are often targeted. Water treatment facilities are often targeted by one state, okay, depriving the masses of clean water. This has been a problem well before October 7th. I wrote a lengthy article in July about ecocide. And more or less, ecocide is what I define as punitive political ecology, or the weaponization of natural resources. Why in July, Russia is believed directly, most likely, absolutely targeted a dam in Ukraine, flooding downstream areas. And what I want to look at is when in history and where is this going on at the very moment. Okay, so that's David Schwimmer. Then we have Angelina Jolie. Now, Why did I choose this particular image? Because Mbembe invokes terms that basically necropolitics is the study of the death world. It's the study of the bare life, minimum, life at a minimum. And when I look at the images of the bombing of the Jabalia refugee camp, these were the images, the words that came into my mind. The images correspond to it. But in this case, what is Julie saying? Again, now we have another celebrity conducting her own celebrity diplomacy. This is the deliberate bombing of a trapped population who have nowhere to flee. So let's remember, if we theorize her, Angelina Jolie, of course, came to fame due to her Hollywood career, but then worked her way up as terms in the beginning as a goodwill ambassador to the UNHCR, and then a special envoy before resigning about a year ago from her position of representing the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Nevertheless, if we theorize Angelina Jolie, celebrity diplomacy gives her the ability to communicate to the masses, but her entry into the international relations realm was via the UN. But now she still advocates on behalf of refugees in this context, or human security, we could say. Gaza has been an open-air prison for nearly 2 decades and is fast becoming a mass grave. Okay, that is literally almost channeling Memembe and necropolitics. 40% of those killed are innocent children. And again, it's dealing with the way the state projects death onto a massive innocent civilian population. Whole families are being murdered. While the world watches, and with the active support of many governments, millions of Palestinian civilians, children, women, families, are being collectively punished and dehumanized, all while depriving food, medicine, and humanitarian aid against international law. By refusing to demand a humanitarian ceasefire and blocking the UN Security Council from imposing one on both parties, world leaders are complicit in these crimes. Again, so here now it's an individual who basically invokes the need of a multilateral institution to declare a ceasefire between the state and a non-state actor, which is practically a quasi-state. And look at the complexity of international relations in this, what I just described to you in the last sentence. So just a quick history. Let's begin from antiquity. A couple of places in terms of eschatology. Let's just look at this space right here, the buffer zone between the Kingdom of Egypt and the New Babylonian Empire. Okay. And I want you to look at this space right here. By the way, Megiddo, you might know of it by its full name, Har Megiddo, otherwise rendered into Armageddon in English. We tend to forget Armageddon is not a place. It's not an event, it's an actual place. And not too far from where the conflict is occurring. Then if I go to the next slide, let's look at the rise of the Persian Empire. For at that time, the Assyrians, you see how Gaza shows up even in antiquity. So what is being fought over is not just some narrow strip of land. This has been a territory that, now we're just going into old-fashioned geopolitics, a territory that has been contested since antiquity. What is being blown away aren't just refugee camps. This is one of the most ancient, continuously inhabited pieces of the earth. And you can see why. It's the gateway to Egypt, or the other way around, it's the gateway to Asia. It's also the gateway to Europe. So that when the Persian Empire expanded, you see where ancient Egypt and the Assyrian Empire ended. Gaza was that buffer zone. It was the borderland. It was the boundary. When the Persians do eventually, the Great Persian Empire, the first superpower, marches into Egypt, you have to go through Gaza. And the same with Alexander. When Alexander created Alexandria in Egypt, you have to go through Gaza as well. And then if we go to the Roman Empire, again, here we see Gaza coming up again. And of course, a couple of the Roman legions being stationed around Megiddo. This is probably why St. John the Divine, when he was imagining an apocalypse in his lifetime, assumed it would happen around Megiddo between the true believers and the Roman occupiers. Okay, now From this, I want to go into a very eschatological history of this conflict. And like I said, it's more morbid, but don't feel shy if you want to laugh, because I do find this quite funny. It's a video produced, nope, wrong, excuse me. Let me try this again. And if it's slow to respond, then I apologize. That's okay. All right. I have way too many tabs open. You can see that. Now, where is it? It should be here. There we go. Oh, yeah. If it doesn't work. Okay, there we go. Okay. I'll watch the following, and I'm just going to speak over it. It's an American Jewish woman's take on this conflict, produced 10 years ago, but see the relevance for it in understanding the current conflict. So basically, she's challenging the narrative of the Israeli state or the Jews to this homeland. By she's saying this land is mine, she's asking how many people in the past have said the same thing about this territory. And she begins with a caveman. A caveman who once said this land was mine. And then was killed for it. And then the ancient Egyptians came, just as I described to you on the maps. Now here comes the ancient Persians. And then, of course, the Israelites settled this land. And so here are the children running free. Until this could be either the Assyrians or the Babylonians. Okay. Then here come the Greeks under Alexander. Other Greeks. The Romans. And just keep in mind, in real history, they would have all fought over Gaza. Now, this refers to the revolt against the Romans. But here we're now around 70 AD. Okay. So that's referring to the Jewish revolt and the Roman counterattack. And then the dispersion of the Jews, otherwise known as the diaspora. Then we have the Muslims arriving, the variety of Arabs, the Crusades, Mamluks, supposed to be Ottomans. And then look who comes. Now we get the imperial level begins. Here comes the British. And then referring to the divide and conquer amongst, this would be the early Zionist settlers. Now remember, this was created in 2013. This is Hezbollah. This is supposed to be the Israeli military. And this is supposed to be Hamas. Remember, again, back in 2013. And what was she arguing back 10 years ago? Who really can claim this land is mine? Well, the angel of death. That's the one who could really say this land belongs to me. Okay. So in this kind of, again, a morose history of death, That's what we went over. Now we jump to another era. Okay. You see, the next argument I make, if this is kind of a history of, it's a necropolitical approach to the history of the region. There is something, again, I started to ask, when was it that suicide was used in Muslim history in terms of something that was weaponized? Because Islam, like Christianity and Judaism, considers suicide a cardinal sin. So now we're going into the realm of theology, right? At this time then, so this is because you would get the idea that Muslims have been doing these kind of suicide attacks since time immemorial. Okay, that's a myth. And I'm going to show you maybe only one case where certain death was guaranteed. But notice the word there, it was certain death. Martyrdom means when you go into battle, you have a fighting chance, but there it is God's will whether you live or die. Okay, and that's the definition. That was essence being dying a martyr in Islam. Okay, but nowhere in Islamic history did I find any record of Muslims going into battle knowing deliberately they're going to kill themselves. So you have to understand this is a modern phenomenon. Okay. And the earliest record I could find comes from Marco Polo. And keep in mind, this is more of a legend than fact. And it's with the following group that Marco Polo comes across while he's traveling across Iran on the way to China. It's the tale of the old man of the mountain. Now look at the book where I'm getting Marco Polo's account from. The old man of the mountain controlled a fortress known as Alamut in northern Iran. And there Marco Polo heard. Now, when Marco Polo had crossed through Iran, already the Mongols had destroyed the fortress a couple of decades earlier. So remember, this would be hearsay. Marco Polo heard of the legend of the fortress of Alamut. The boy at his court, such boys of 12 years old that seemed to him destined to become courageous men. When the old man sent them now into a garden in the fortress, in groups of 4, 10, or 20, he gave them hashish to drink. They slept for 3 days. Then they were carried sleeping into the garden where he had them awaken. So for all intents and purposes, these boys thought they had woken up in paradise, in heaven. And by the way, paradise is just a Persian word for a walled garden. When these young men woke, they found themselves in the garden with all these marvelous things. They truly believed themselves to be in paradise. And these damsels were always with them in songs and great entertainments. They received everything they asked for, so they would have never left the garden of their own will. When the old man then wished to kill someone, or in other words, have somebody assassinated, he would take a young man and tell him they could return to paradise if they entered his service and followed his instructions or died in his service. So in other words, what were these young boys often told to do? Was to enter the bodyguard corps of a particular regional leader that the old man wanted to have eliminated. The old man of the mountain belonged to the Ismaili sect of Islam, Ismaili Shiism. He ordered assassinations of the rival Sunni leaders of the Seljuk Turks at that time. And so sure enough, according to legend, these young boys who thought they had witnessed paradise would have entered, let's say, the bodyguard corps of the Seljuk Sultan. Al-Marashi, if I'm not mistaken. And sure enough, these young boys would come of age, serving, protecting the Sultan, and when they got the order to kill your boss, sure enough, these secret cells of the followers of the old man of the mountain would kill the Sultan, the most powerful man in the world at that time. Now, of course, the Sultan at that time of the Seljuk Empire was grooming his son to rule, right? So sure enough, in succession, the son takes over. But little does the son know that his bodyguards are also followers of the old man of the mountain. And so sure enough, the son is assassinated. Okay, but then you have the vizier, the prime minister, Nizam al-Mulk, who could run the empire. But little does Nizam al-Mulk know His bodyguards are also the secret followers of the old man of the mountain. And so in this series of 3 assassinations, you destroy the strongest state that could threaten the network around the fortress of Aleppo. Okay? Now, in Arabic, how would you say somebody who consumes hashish? Okay. Well, in Arabic, you say Hashishiin. Hence, this club in France that kind of exotifies their old habits of smoking hashish in the garden. Of course, when Marco Polo would have heard the word Hashishiin, like in Italian, he wouldn't have pronounced the H. He would have probably said assassin. And this is where we get the word assassin from. Okay? So imagine this. Combining both hashish and the Assassin's Creed. That sounds like for some of you maybe a good Friday night or your hobbies, not to suggest anything, but the whole point is, right? This is the only time I could find in history where you had Muslims, not even Sunni Muslims, Ismaili Muslims, going towards a certain death, that they knew that the minute they killed their boss, they too would be killed for conducting this assassination, but it didn't matter because they would go to the paradise that they were introduced to when they were children in the garden when they were in their drug state. So then when did the use of suicide bombings begin? Well, we have to look at the various waves of terrorism. The first wave was anarchist terrorism. The second wave was secular nationalist terrorism. The third wave, national religious terrorism. And the fourth wave, transnational religious terrorism. So what's the difference? Well, let's begin. Okay. The first wave, look at the variety of anarchist assassinations that occurred here. The president of France, stabbed by an Italian anarchist, 1894. The prime minister of Spain, shot by an Italian anarchist, August 1897. Empress Sisi of Austria, stabbed by an Italian anarchist the next year. King Umberto of Italy, shot by an Italian-American anarchist in 1900, just 2 years later. And finally, President William McKinley, shot by an American anarchist of Czech heritage in 1901. This is what I would argue is the first wave of terrorism. The point was your assassination generated mass media attention. You inspired the masses, and this is the key for terrorism. You need the mass media to actually do the terrorizing to the masses, you see. That's what would separate the assassinations here opposed to, let's say, the killing of Julius Caesar. Did Brutus have an Instagram account where he could step over, Julius Caesar's dead body and say, I killed him? No, there was no way to reach the masses. This is the key here. The second wave now, let's look at what unites the second wave of terrorist groups. And this is a very good database. I just took screenshots of various terrorist groups and their attacks over time. And most of these attacks over time were post-1945. So take an example of the Kurdistan Workers' Party or the Basque Fatherland and Freedom Party. Okay, what do they have in common? The PKK and ETA. Number one, secular. Number two, both left-leaning. Number three, trying to create a homeland within an existing state. In both cases, the boundaries of their future states are more or less defined. Okay. Somebody who's fighting for ETA doesn't want to conquer Barcelona. If Barcelona is part of Catalonia, they're thinking of a defined Basque homeland. Somebody in the PKK, again, is seeking a Kurdish homeland within the borders of Turkey. So bound by geography. Now let's look at some other parties united by a particular leftist ideology. Sendero Luminoso of Peru, FARC of Colombia, okay, and again the PKK. Again, these are groups that are avowedly Marxist. In other words, secular. This making the second wave of terrorism. And then let's go to the next group. The IRA and the LTTE, the Liberation Tigers of Tamaulipas. Not only are these groups bound by geography, their geography is an island. The oceans surround them, right? The IRA fighting for a unified Ireland. The LTTE fighting on behalf of the Tamil Hindu minority group on the island of Sri Lanka. Even the LTTE was, even though it was a primarily Hindu group, they were very left-leaning. fighting for something secular. The Liberation Tigers were the first one to use the suicide bomber. They were the first group to have the idea of putting explosives on a human being and have them approach a military target. Now, remember, there's no promise of paradise for a group that's primarily secular, particularly a group whose religion doesn't have really an idea of an afterlife. The suicide bomber in the 20th century was a tactic used by a secular group. No, I haven't mentioned a single Muslim group yet. Okay. During the second wave, here we see somebody named Yasser Arafat as part of an umbrella group of Palestinians fighting the state of Israel. A non-state actor, it's an organization that he eventually takes over called the Palestine Liberation Organization. It's an umbrella group. There were other groups within it. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, led by George Habash, a Palestinian Christian. And keep in mind, in the 1960s, if you want to talk about the deadliest terrorist group in the Middle East, it wasn't any group inspired by jihadism. The idea hadn't been born yet. It was a group led by a Palestinian Christian. And it was Marxist-Leninist. You see what I'm saying? This was the era of left-leaning groups, right? Then, if you look at the other group, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command, it was a splinter group led by one Ahmed Jibril. The Popular Liberation Front, okay, its Marxism is obvious in its symbolism. But again, what do I remember what I'm arguing? Even though they don't have a state, they're still bound by geography. When they envision a future state, they're basically saying, this is it. This is what we call Palestine. This is what we're fighting for. And keep in mind, remember, groups like this often work together. So if you look at the Italian Red Brigades, just look at the stars, they often cooperated. They were all part of the same left-leaning movements of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, all the way to the 80s. And the whole point of hijacking a plane was for the following. If you look at this Palestinian group, look at the megaphone. The idea was he conducted a hijacking to get the attention of the world media to the plight of the Palestinians. Look what I just said. How do you get attention of the world to the plight of the Palestinians? In the 1960s, this is it. You hijacked a plane. And keep in mind, members of this organization included women. If we look at this woman here, her name is Leila Khaled. Her ring is made out of a grenade pin. That's what she was married to. The third wave begins in the 1980s with the revolution in Iran and the formation of an Islamic Republic. Notice I don't call it an Islamic revolution. You had a revolution in Iran, and within that process, an Islamic Republic consolidates and emerges. And what you have here are two groups. One is Hezbollah, and the other is Hamas. And they're both born in the 1980s. And I would argue they both are born as a result of the events that begin with the formation of the Islamic Republic. Now, even a group like Hezbollah calls itself the Muslim Resistance, the Muqawama Islamiyya. So the whole point is this. It's bounded by geography in Lebanon. Okay, no longer secular, inspired by religion, but still bounded by geography. The Islamic resistance in Lebanon. Now, in this particular case, right, Hezbollah is primarily a Shia group. But who are they fighting? Now, they're created as a proxy of the Islamic Republic of Iran, but they're targeting the US. And Hezbollah realizes, okay, we cannot fight the US on equal terms. And so they introduced something from a rival, or I wouldn't say a rival, another one of the militias in Lebanon civil war. That militia was called the Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party. Again, entirely secular. Based in Lebanon, it was fighting for a greater Syria. When Israel invaded in 1982, a member of the SSNP strapped a bomb onto the human body and detonated it. That was the first time where you could say we have a documented case of a suicide attack in the Middle East. The SSNP, entirely secular. Hezbollah basically says, Suicide is forbidden. But if somebody were to take a truck on a one-way mission to fight a stronger army, this isn't suicide, this is martyrdom. We call it suicide, but Hezbollah would say, no, this is a martyr who knows that basically they're not going to survive this attack. And so this is what you have now for the first time. It's 1983, and keep in mind, Hezbollah is a Shia Muslim organization. And then Hezbollah attacked the Marine barracks in the US in 1983, one of the largest explosions since World War II at that time. And the thing about this attack was it worked. The US withdrew. And Hezbollah, a non-state actor, defeated a superpower during the Cold War. And there's no turning back. Now, here let's look at the emblem of Hamas. So we're about 1988, and now Hamas has emerged. And if you look at Hamas again, look what I highlight right there. Even though it calls itself the same thing, the Islamic resistance movement. It's religious, but it's still bounded by the geography of its secular predecessors. What did Hamas seek to create? Was on one level a standing army. Okay. But now it's not until 1996 that what you have for the first time in the Arab Sunni world is basically adopting what Hezbollah did. Because we can't defeat the Israelis militarily. Now, this is the key. They're not attacking a military target per se. They attack in 1996 an Israeli bus. But what is their argument? Any Israeli civilian, whether it's female or male, can be a reservist, and thus is a legitimate target. In 1996, the Hamas bus bombings, I would argue, derailed the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Now, there's multiple players to blame as well. Who took power in 1996? A fringe politician who used the bus bombings to get elected. His name was Benjamin Netanyahu. And that was the other part of the equation. And more or less, he's been in and out of politics since. Silvio Berlusconi, if you will, of Israel. And now you see how the equations came. If you want to see one film that explains, now let's go back to the necropolitics. One film that explains the emergence of Hamas, even though it's not said explicitly, is a film called Paradise Now. Now, up until this point, never had women been used as suicide bombers. But what we're seeing here is now an evolution. It's from Layla Khalid fighting for the secular Palestinian resistance to a woman named Reem Riyashi. And why does she decide to become a suicide bomber? It's for the following. The Israelis wouldn't expect it. It's an innovation in the tactics. Well, what's surprising about this is just not too long ago, I was giving another lecture on something completely different, okay, on the various Arabic words for love. Now, why do I include this here? Because the final Arabic word for love, hope, is somebody commented, this is what a parent must feel for her child. She was saying it in the feminine. Hope is the longing love involving an internal struggle leading to a personal sacrifice. A parent would often sacrifice themselves for their child, right? And now look at this. And when she said that, this person in the audience, I thought about Reem's case. Reem was a mother. Reem had a 5-year-old daughter and still killed herself for this mission. Now, before every one of these missions, it's not enough to do it. You have to record your farewell message. Because the act of violence only exists once. The farewell message is what inspires. So let's watch it. If it works. So again, now we're not just watching the now keep in mind what makes this necropolitical is this: Hamas chooses who commits suicide in its name. So necropolitics is the point of kind of choosing between life and death. Yes, the entire film I showed you, Paradise Now, is about vetting the person who will commit the suicide bombing because you want to make sure this person is going to go through with the attack. In other words, Hamas had decided that we can trust the Reem would go through with the attack. So we'll just watch this. I am the martyr, right? I'm not committing suicide. And again, with the promise of heaven. This is not a sin. Again, the reference to heaven twice. Okay. So, there was a case in the US. Even if we speak about necropolitics and biopolitics, I mean, there's no greater case of the realm of biopolitics and debate over abortion in the US. Hobby Lobby is a hobby store in the US that is anti-abortion. Here is a woman, so is the fast food place called Chick-fil-A. And what is she doing? She's wearing a t-shirt that says pro-life, basically in support of Hobby Lobby and Chick-fil-A. People on the internet said, that's great, but why didn't you take a picture with your gun and Bible? They're not joking. And so sure enough, she said, yes, I'll do it now, another picture with my flag, my assault rifle, and my Bible. Biggest compliment I'm getting about my Hobby Lobby pic is there's no gun, Bible, or flag. Trying to make up for it. And you know what is interesting is then somebody put this image next to hers and saying, what is the difference between you and this woman for Hamas? Now, the fourth wave is this, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and ISIS. And in this case, Al-Qaeda, what is the difference? It is the fourth wave. It is transnational. It is not bounded by geography. And of course, who would have guessed this lanky teenager on the streets of Sweden with his family would eventually grow up to be Osama bin Laden? And again, I kind of call him on some level, he is the old man of the mountain. And I want you to think now, what transformed international relations on the eve of the 21st century? A choreographed suicide. I want you to think of it. 19 men committed suicide, and the war was no going back. International relationships as we knew it, 19 suicides. Now, keep in mind, look what I'm saying, because I'm trying to get you to rethink the role of suicide in history. 19 suicides got the superpower of its time, the unipolar actor, to reorient its policy, to attack Afghanistan, later attack Iraq. Not only was it a suicide, it was choreographed. What do we mean by choreographed? Think of the video you saw earlier of Reem Rayashi that had to be filmed. And I want you to think of this. If you're planning an attack on 9/11, how do you guarantee the cameras will capture the attack? If your attack is only as good as the media that will show it to you, none of you were probably born around 9/11. How do you get terrorized by these events? You have to record it. How do you guarantee it gets recorded on film? The thing is, with the first tower, there are no guarantees. There are no guarantees. And I want you to think, when the first tower was hit, it was just handheld tourist video camera footage showing the plane hit the first tower. But what happened then? Every film crew in Lower Manhattan was on the site. There you have the professionals to capture this moment. And do you see how do you guarantee the video footage? You staggered the attacks. The first plane hits, 17 minutes later, the second plane hits. That is a mass suicide for the TV cameras. So if I go back to this film now, look what I called the 19 hijackers. I called them flying cyborgs. Now this gets to the next level of analysis. Donna Haraway is a feminist scholar who basically published the Cyborg Manifesto. She's at UC Santa Cruz, and her argument is, what is a cyborg? A cybernetic organism. It's a term that was invented when humanity started to go to space. And the argument is humans cannot survive in space. They're going to need to fuse with some kind of artificial lungs to breathe in space. What is a cyborg then? A cybernetic organism. You probably think of Terminator, but it's something much more banal. If you have a pacemaker, technically you're a cyborg. If it's fused to your body, when you go scuba diving, your artificial lung behind you, you are a cyborg. Now, if you look at this film, and speaking of the history of suicide, we look at the word we use, kamikaze. The greatest number of American fatalities in the Pacific were from Japanese pilots who fused their body with the airplane. They were flying cyborgs. The weapon wasn't a detached katana blade. The weapon was the body fused to the airplane. This is the cyborg of the 21st century. Is the explosives are fused to the human body, and it's become iconic. Let's go back to Guernica. This is Aleponica, created by a Portuguese graphic artist. So not Pablo Picasso, but from neighbor country. And again, now look at the replacements, right? And then if you look at the corner, you can barely see it. The person clad in black with a suicide vest, that's a reference to ISIS. Human security issues, the refugees going to the European Union, the woman wailing with a dead child, that hasn't changed. And even ISIS, which is a very misogynistic, patriarchal organization, even it used female suicide bombers. In her case, the vest failed to explode. That's how she was captured. And sure enough, the suicide bomber went into a mosque in Iraq in 2006, detonated it, sparking an entire sectarian civil war in Iraq. A single suicide bomber sparked not only could transform foreign relations, but domestic dynamics. That's me in front of the site being reconstructed. And God, my dad's short, but you know. What is it really like to fight for the Islamic State? I highly recommend you watch this video on your own. I wanted to open up for questions. But this is the video produced from Vice of the final moments of an ISIS suicide bomber. In this case, the suicide bomber has evolved. This entire truck clad with armor is the explosion. And it was ISIS's greatest weapon on the battlefield. If you noticed, I began my talk with a lot of alliteration, using letters that sounded alike. Of course, look at what The Guardian is doing as well. Disappointed, disenchanted, defiant, inside the world of West Bank's angry armed youth. And I want you now to think of these armed youths and the role of suicide in conflict. Suicide is temporal. I just want you to think of it just from a mental health issue. And this is the thing, is rarely their relationship between mental health and international relations is rarely studied. When somebody commits suicide, it's temporal. Their past has killed their present. And when the present is killed, your future is also killed. I mean, when you contemplate suicide, that is it. It's everything leading up to your past has killed your present. You can't think of continuing into the future. It's a temporal trauma. It's a temporal torment. What is any different then from somebody who volunteers to go on these suicide missions for Hamas or ISIS? It's their past, whether it's an occupation of their land, kills their present. They can't imagine living, and here's the necropolitical, as the living dead anymore. So they kill themselves because they can't imagine a future. The past is political, but we don't know what kind of mental health torments they've also had. Now, to go back to the history of suicide in international relations, sorry, I should have warned you. Look at the following. It doesn't always have to be explosive suicides. One of the most powerful suicides in human history. Look at this Buddhist monk who self-emulated himself in Vietnam. Perfect composure. This is somebody who's literally a living flame, yet doesn't move, doesn't twitch. Somebody who is in so powerful of a meditative state. Okay. And you see the Buddhist monks in the background complaining against the Vietnamese government in the South that's allied with the US. So much so that a single Buddhist monk got America to reconsider its alliance with South Vietnam. That if only they listened. Because instead of listening to this advice of the monk, they spent 20 years pouring in weapons and arms to the South Vietnamese government, leading to one of its greatest foreign policy disasters. That's the role of history in understanding what happened since October 7th. And then finally, look at these images here. I just want to show you something from the past. Another element. It's a bit off script. When was this picture taken? Not October 7th. It's the skies over Israel. It's not October 7th. It's 1991. The missiles that are coming into Israeli airspace, they're coming from Iraq. They're Scud missiles. They're ballistic missiles. Why did Iraq launch those missiles in a war that they were already losing to the US? That really wasn't going to change much in terms of the battlefield outcome. When I was in Jerusalem, a Palestinian taxi driver, when he found out I was from Iraq, was effusive in his praise of Saddam Hussein. You see, this was in 1999 when I was in Jerusalem, right before the peace process failed. Why was he effusive about Saddam Hussein? Saddam made Israel cry. The Scuds didn't do much damage, but they violated Israel's ontological security, the sense of well-being, the sense of everyday security. The Scuds sent the Israelis into bunkers. The Israelis were fearing that the Scuds might be armed with chemical weapons. And for this Palestinian driver in Jerusalem, yes, Saddam made Israel cry. You see, Saddam lost the war with the US, but he won the war for the memory of the Palestinians. You might ask, why did Hamas launch these rockets in a war that they knew would devastate Gaza? But militarily, they are losing. Hamas is losing. But what is it winning? It's the war for Palestinian memory. Now, I just told you I'm from Iraq, but you also have to understand the complexity of Middle Eastern families. Look at this person, a nativity scene to fit the season. It's Christmas time, and I want you to think of this. Who is Raif? He's my family. So I said I'm Iraqi. I come from the Iraqi Muslim family, but I also have Palestinian Christian relatives from Bethlehem. I can't even imagine, as an Iraqi Muslim whose family originally comes from Mecca, talk about from one holy place. My dream would be somebody who comes from one of the holiest places in Islam, celebrating Christmas with a Palestinian Christian relative in Bethlehem itself. For that to happen, that would be another miracle, just like Jesus's birth. For that to happen. Okay. But this is where I left you. I began this lecture on the plains of Armageddon. I end with Bethlehem as Christmas approaches. And so this was my attempt to basically take an international relations event and look at the human beings that are involved. Essentially, you had not just a lecture on necropolitics, but human security as well. And so these are the theories I was trying to introduce you to, or approaches and paradigms. Do you have any questions? For me, yes.
Is the necropolitics part of a broader foreign policy with Israel? Or would it be the main,
You would say that, yes.
or is it the main focus of their foreign policy when it comes to the Palestinians?
You see, that's what so many scholars used necropolitics and applied it to the Palestinians well before October 7th. So in other words, yes, but then October 7th entered a new phase. The necropolitics is this. It is basically saying, we look at it right now as we speak. We cannot have a ceasefire, right? Even if Palestinian civilians will die, it's the price, it's worth the price of eliminating Hamas. That is quintessential necropolitics. In other words, all those Palestinians who die in the process of our elimination of Hamas, that is quintessentially the essence of necropolitics. Their lives are worth it. Or in other words, Palestinian lives matter less than the Israeli lives that were killed on October 7th, you see. And thus, if there's 20,000 dead in response to 1,200 Israelis who were killed, that is the cruel ratio of necropolitics, you see. So it's both of your questions. The answer is both.
But I just had one more thing.
Of course, please.
You said, not you, but it was in the presentation before. So necropolitics is also the right to expose other people to death or death. Do you think the case?
It's cruel to say this, but sometimes I'll tell you this: when you're from the war zones, but you're not there, what you have is survivor's guilt. That you feel that, okay, why am I the lucky one, right? So that's the thing. You don't have to be in a war zone to feel the trauma of a war zone. So this is how I got interested in this subject, was looking at my own mental health and then thinking, how bad does it have to be for somebody to commit suicide? Because on my level, it was pretty bad. So I can't imagine how bad it has to be for somebody to take their own life. And so I'm really glad you asked that, because again, rarely do we talk about not only mental health and international relations, but like the mental health of, just in our everyday life as well, and how that the subjects we study can affect us. And, you don't have to come from the region as well to be affected by these conflicts at all. So that's it. These are hard subjects to study. So that's it. It's a really good question. Yeah, really good question. So another hand up. Yes.
Hello, President Kate is coming to project, and we gave this wonderful speech. Necropolitics, the psychological warfare in terms of
Really good question.
creating the thing we are not they are the skeleton we need to stay here.
Right, yeah, no, it's very good. It is really at the core of psychological politics. I mean, it's really I'm glad you brought that up, because that's its essence. It is, you are convincing a group of people psychologically we are more valuable than the other. At the end of the day, if you do that, it's easier to kill the other, you see. It's easier to kill the other once you've convinced yourself of that. So when I say it's a psychological warfare, not only is it a psychological weapon against the targeted other, it's a psychological weapon that rallies the masses to fight on behalf of that army. It justifies it. So whether it's this conflict going on, or when we think of the US and Iraq or Afghanistan, yeah, definitely. You think about the calculus there, but with 3,000 deaths in 9/11, that justified hundreds of thousands of Afghans and Iraqis getting killed. And there was never any moral questioning on any of the political elites in the US about that. American lives matter more. Very good question. That's the second question. Yes.
I actually had a second question, but it's probably a little better. But psychologically talking, you mentioned the fourth wave, which is transnational, national. So psychologically talking, is it easier, or is it has less of a toll on them, a psychological toll, to kill people from far away, and then produce this the consequence of necropolitics in other parts of the globe than national? And why?
That's really good.
What would actually incentivize people to take these matters outside rather than keeping it inside?
Okay, that's really good. Because it also reminded me you just reminded me to say, who would have thought that the third wave would make a comeback? But that's essentially what, so I'm glad you reminded me of the waves because I was supposed to set up a conclusion that I never made. So who would have thought the third wave would make a comeback? And with the fourth wave, um, what's interesting about this in terms of the fourth wave, you're absolutely right, the distance involved, right? Think about this, when it was, let's say, on Irish soil, right? That was terrorism that was a lot more intimate for the British because it involved Northern Ireland, it involved targeting sites in London, for example. With the fourth wave, I think it goes, and again, let's think of the ontological security and the distance involved. With the fourth wave, think about you're at a rock concert in Paris and you could be attacked, right? With the transnational, the key about it, yeah, you're not anywhere that is not bounded by geography means anywhere could be attacked. But then you see how the war zone changes, right? Anyone in France who is Muslim now, in theory, could be the new front line. And what does France do to retaliate for, let's say, the attack on the rock concert in November 2015? Okay. It bombs Syria, you see. Even though a good number of the attackers were probably of Algerian origin, if I'm not mistaken. There you go. There you go. The victims are much more blurred with the fourth wave. Absolutely. Yeah, very good question. What do you think the fifth wave would be? Sometimes I wonder if artificial intelligence, like how if you combine that with terrorism, what could occur? This, like I said, the subject takes its tolls on me, particularly when you think of really morbid subjects like this. But when you try to anticipate, what would the fifth wave be? No, that was just a thought that was in my mind as I flew into here this morning. But very good.
So if possible, I would like to just refer to the first statement of Hamas in 7th of October after their attack. One of the phrases they used in their normal, actually official declaration was that